In 1955, a man measured his worth by what hung on his pegboard. His tools were extensions of his own hands, tuned over decades, and he'd sooner lend you his truck than his good socket set. Number 8 could read a roof's every angle without a single calculation. And number 3, borrow it once and you'd ruin it forever. These 15 tools built America, and no father alive would let them leave his garage. Before we start, hit subscribe. Let's count down. Number 15, the wooden folding rule. Long before the coiling steel tape measure clipped onto every belt, the folding rule lived in the bib pocket of every carpenter's overalls. 6 feet of hard maple, hinged into 8 neat sections that snapped open with a flick of the thumb, marked in black and red down to the 16th. Lufkin and Stanley made the best ones, and a father spent years breaking his in until it opened smooth as a card trick. The brass joints had to be oiled and worked just so. Too loose and the rule sagged in the middle. Too tight and it cracked at the hinge. He would slide out the little brass extension at the end to measure the inside of a window frame down to a 64th of an inch, closer than any tape could ever manage. In 1950, a good Lufkin ran about $1.25, real money for a workman clocking 60 cents an hour. That is exactly why he would not hand it over. Loan a folding rule to a careless neighbor, and it came back with a snapped section or a sprung hinge, and a rule with one bad joint was a rule you could no longer trust. A carpenter who could not trust his measure could not trust his cut. He would point you toward the hardware store and tell you to buy your own. The tape measure buried it in the 60s, faster and longer and retractable. But the old-timers swore the folding rule never stretched, never lied, and stood up on its own when you needed a third hand. Number 14, the bit brace and auger bits. This was the drill before the drill had a cord. A sweeping steel U-frame with a rounded knob on top and a chuck on the bottom, worked by cranking the whole thing in a big circle while you leaned your chest into the pad. Paired with a set of auger bits kept oiled in a canvas roll, a man could bore a clean, dead-straight 1-inch hole through a floor joist by hand, quietly, in the dark, without waking a soul in the house. The secret was the little screw tip on the auger, called the lead, which pulled the bit into the wood so all the man had to do was steer. A father guarded those bits like they were surgical instruments because they were. A Russell Jennings set could cost him $3 or $4 in the 1940s, and the cutting spurs were fragile. Here's why the bits never left his sight. Hand a brace to a borrower and he would hit a hidden nail, roll the cutting edge, and hand it back dull with a shrug. Sharpening an auger bit meant a special little file and a steady hand at the workbench. 20 minutes of patience for a hole that should have taken 30 seconds. Fathers did not lend that kind of work to a man who would not respect it. When the electric drill took over garages in the 50s and 60s, the brace went up on a hook and stayed there. But ask any old carpenter, and he will tell you a brace never stripped a screw, never burned out, and gave him a feel for the wood that no trigger ever could. Number 13, the egg beater hand drill. For the smaller holes, the ones too fine for the brace, a father reached for the hand drill, the one everybody called the egg beater, for the crank handle that spun a set of open gears on the side. You cradled it against your palm, turned the crank, and those bright little gears whirred through a stack of teeth to spin the chuck fast enough to drill sheet metal or start a pilot hole for a hinge screw. The good ones from Miller's Falls even hid a set of tiny drill bits inside a hollow wooden handle, so a man was never caught without the right size. It cost maybe $2 new, but its value was in the delicacy. Those exposed gears were its weakness and its warning. Force it, bear down too hard, or let it bind in the metal, and you could shear a gear tooth clean off, and a drill with a chipped gear jumped and clattered forever after. A father knew his own touch, exactly how much pressure the tool would take before it complained. A borrower did not. That is why the egg beater stayed on his side of the bench. He would drill your hole for you, standing right there, before he ever put that crank in your hand. Cordless drills made it a relic. But hold one today and give the crank a spin, and there is a quiet, mechanical honesty to it. Gears you can see, a tool that only fails if you abuse it. Number 12, the Yankee spiral ratchet screwdriver. Now here is a tool that felt like a magic trick. You pushed down on the handle and the whole shaft spiraled, driving the screw with a satisfying ratchet click, then sprang back up on its own for the next push. Made famous by North Brothers and later carried by Stanley, the Yankee let a man sink 100 screws into a porch floor in the time it took to drink a cup of coffee, no wrist twisting required. It could be set to drive, to loosen, or to lock rigid like an ordinary screwdriver. A father's Yankee was a thing of pride, the spiral shaft polished bright from use. The return spring tuned to snap back with just the right punch, and that spring was exactly why he would not lend it. The mechanism inside was a coiled clockwork that hated abuse. Let the shaft snap back uncontrolled a few times, or jam it, or drop it on the concrete, and the spiral would bind and lose its bounce. A borrowed Yankee that came back sticky was a small heartbreak, so the father kept it in the top drawer, wrapped in an oiled rag, and if a neighbor needed screws driven, well, the neighbor could borrow the father's afternoon, not his Yankee. The power screwdriver made it obsolete, but there are woodworkers today who pay collector prices to feel that spiral push again, that clever pump that turned a chore into something close to fun. Number 11, the draw knife. 2 wooden handles set at the ends of a single wide blade, pulled toward the body in long, curling strokes. The draw knife was how a man shaved a fence rail round, tapered an axe handle, or peeled the bark off a green log before it went into the wood stove. It looked crude and dangerous, and in the wrong hands it was, but a father who knew his draw knife could take a paper-thin shaving off oak with the control of a barber. The edge was everything. He honed it to a razor and stropped it smooth, and he could feel through the handles the exact moment the grain wanted to tear. That razor edge is why it never, ever got lent out. One careless pull into a hidden staple or a patch of grit, and the edge rolled or chipped, and honing a draw knife back to true meant an hour bent over the oilstone with the blade clamped in the vise, chasing the perfect angle down its whole length. A father was not about to burn an hour fixing what a borrower broke in a second. He would shave your handle for you and send you home. The spokes have, the router, and the belt sander push the draw knife into the corner of the barn, but there is still no faster way to turn a rough branch into a smooth, living curve, and the men who kept theirs sharp knew it. Number 10, the hand plane. Here's where things get personal. A father's bench plane, a Stanley Bailey number 4 or number 5 with its rosewood tote worn to the shape of his own grip, was maybe the most jealously guarded tool in the whole shop. That plane was not a tool you could just pick up and use. It was tuned. The mouth was set to a hair, the iron ground and honed and bedded. The frog adjusted so the blade took a whisper-thin shaving that came off in one long, translucent curl and left the board smooth as glass. It cost only a couple of dollars new in the 1940s, but the value was in the 100 hours of fussing that made it sing, and that is precisely why it stayed on the shelf. Drop a plane on a concrete floor and you could crack the casting or chip the iron. Let a borrower run it over a painted board or a sandy plank and he would nick the edge. And reflattening a sole and rehoning an iron was an afternoon's work. A borrower would never set it back right either, and a plane set wrong just tore the wood and dug in. A father would rather plane your board himself, standing at his own bench, than watch a friend undo his careful tuning. Power planers and sanders took over. But a tuned hand plane still leaves a finish no sandpaper can match. Dead flat, faintly polished, the mark of a man who cared. Number 9, the wood chisel set. A father's chisels came in a cloth roll or stood in a rack above the bench, each one honed to shave the hair off his forearm, and he treated them with something close to reverence. Made by Stanley or Buck Brothers, the good ones held an edge through hours of paring dovetails and chopping mortises for a door hinge. A man could spend 20 minutes on the oilstone getting a single chisel back to a mirror edge, and he knew exactly how it would bite. But this is the one that started fights. The cardinal sin, the thing that made a father snatch a chisel out of a borrower's hand, was watching someone use a wood chisel as a pry bar, or a screwdriver, or, God forbid, a paint can opener. One good pry against a stubborn board, and the edge chipped or the tip snapped clean off, and a chipped chisel was a ruined afternoon. Fathers told their sons the same line their fathers told them: a chisel is for cutting wood and nothing else, ever. So when the neighbor came asking, the answer was no, and the neighbor knew better than to ask twice. Routers and multi-tools do the joinery now, but a sharp chisel and a wooden mallet still cut a mortise cleaner than any machine, and the men who owned good ones would sooner lend you their wristwatch. Number 8, the steel framing square. Second pattern break, and this one is pure genius. The framing square looked like nothing, just a big flat L of steel, 2 arms marked in inches. But stamped along those arms were the rafter tables, tiny rows of numbers that let a carpenter lay out the exact angle and length of every rafter, brace, and stair stringer in a house without a lick of geometry or a single calculation. A man who understood his square could frame a roof by reading numbers off a piece of steel, and the roof would come together tight as a drum. It cost $1 or $2, but the knowledge locked inside it was worth a college course. And here is why he would not lend it. That square was only useful if its 2 arms met at a perfect 90 degrees. Drop it once on the concrete, knock the corner, and you could spring it a fraction out of true. To the eye it looked fine, but every line a man struck with a bent square was wrong, and he would not know until the walls did not close. A father tested his square against a known edge and babied it, because a square out of true was worse than no square at all. He would lay out your rafters for you before he let that L of steel out of his hands. Speed squares and framing calculators replaced it, but an old carpenter with a steel square and the rafter tables could still shame a man with a phone app. Number 7, the Arkansas oil stone. Every one of these tools we have talked about, the plane, the chisel, the draw knife, was only as good as the stone that sharpened it, and a father's oil stone was the beating heart of the whole shop. A fine Arkansas novaculite stone, quarried from the hills of Arkansas and prized the world over, sat in its own little wooden box on the bench, its surface kept wet with a few drops of honing oil that carried the ground steel away. A man could spend 40 years learning to read the feel of a blade dragging across that stone, the exact angle, the exact pressure, the moment the burr rolled over. A good stone cost real money and took a lifetime to break in flat and true. So he never lent it, because a borrower who did not know how to sharpen would ruin it 2 ways. Bear down in one spot and you dish the stone hollow so it could never grind a straight edge again. Skip the oil and you glaze the surface shut with packed metal until it stopped cutting entirely. A dished, glazed stone was a father's quiet tragedy. He would sharpen your knife for you gladly, but the stone stayed on his bench. Diamond plates and powered grinders do the job faster now. But there are craftsmen today who will tell you a fine Arkansas stone gives an edge nothing else can touch, and they guard theirs just the same. Number 6, the soldering copper. Before the electric soldering gun with its trigger and its instant heat, a man joined metal with a soldering copper, a heavy wedge of solid copper on an iron rod with a wooden handle, heated in the flame of a gas burner or a bed of coals until it glowed. He would pull it from the fire, wipe it, touch it to a bar of solder in a joint, and the heat stored in that lump of copper flowed the solder clean. Tinsmiths mended gutters, and roofers sealed flashing, and hobbyists joined stained glass, all with the copper. The trick, the thing that took years, was tinning the tip, keeping it coated with a bright, clean layer of solder so it would take the heat and give it back. That tin tip is why the copper never got lent. Let it overheat in the fire until it turned black, or scrape the tip on a rough file and you burned off the tinning, and a copper that would not hold solder was a copper that would not work. Retinning meant filing it bright and coaxing the coating back with flux and patience. A father who had spent years babying his tips was not about to watch a friend cook one to ruin in an afternoon. Electric irons and guns made it a museum piece. But there is a whole craft still alive in that glowing lump of copper. Heat you could feel, a tool that asked you to understand fire. Number 5, the Stilson pipe wrench. Now we get to the heavy iron. The Stilson wrench, patented back in 1869 by Daniel Stilson and made famous by companies like Rigid, was the tool that let a man break loose a rusted iron pipe fitting that had not moved in 30 years. Its jaws bit harder the more you pulled, hardened teeth digging into round pipe with a grip that would not slip. A plumber's Stilson was a serious investment, several dollars for a big one, and the teeth and the jaw were its whole reason for being. 2 words: cheater bar. The temptation, when a fitting would not budge, was to slip a length of pipe over the handle for extra leverage and heave with everything you had. A father knew exactly how far his wrench would go before something gave. A borrower did not, and a borrower with a cheater bar would either snap the wrench's handle, or worse, chew the hardened teeth flat so the jaws could never grip again. A pipe wrench with rounded teeth just spun and slipped and skinned your knuckles. So the Stilson lived in the bottom of the toolbox, and the answer to the neighbor with the frozen faucet was a firm no. Modern wrenches do the same job, but the old Stilsons were forged to outlive their owners, and plenty of them are still biting pipe a century later in the hands of men who would still rather lend you their coat. Number 4, the feeler gauges. Here is a tool most people today have never even held. A little folding fan of thin steel leaves, each one machined to a precise thickness, stamped right on the blade, from a few thousandths of an inch on up. In the days when a man tuned his own car in the driveway on a Saturday morning, feeler gauges were how he set the gap on his spark plugs and, more delicate still, the clearance on his engine valves. Slide the right leaf into the gap, feel the exact drag, and the engine ran smooth and lived long. Set it wrong and it burned valves or fouled plugs. These cost only $1 or so, but the whole point of them was precision, and precision is fragile. That is why a father would not lend his set. Those thin leaves bent if you looked at them wrong. Force one into a tight gap, kink it, and it no longer measured true, and a bent feeler gauge lied to you about the one thing that mattered. A man who set his valves with a kinked gauge could cook a cylinder head. A father knew his gauges were straight and true because he had never let a heavy-handed friend near them. He would gap your plugs for you at his own workbench. Fuel injection and sealed engines ended the driveway tune-up, but there is a whole generation who remembers the quiet Saturday ritual of the feeler gauge and the pride of an engine tuned by hand. Number 3, the torque wrench. Third pattern break, and this one comes with a warning. As engines got more precise, so did the men working on them, and the torque wrench was the tool that let a father tighten a bolt to an exact number, not too loose to rattle free, not too tight to snap the head off or warp a cylinder head. The click-type wrenches were the prize, dialed to a setting. They gave a firm, unmistakable click the instant you hit the target, and a good one from a name like Snap-on could cost as much as a week's groceries. And this is the tool a father would defend to the last. A torque wrench was a calibrated instrument, and its calibration was delicate. Drop it once on the garage floor and you could knock it off, so every reading after was a quiet lie. And here is the part borrowers never knew. You were supposed to dial a click wrench back down to its lowest setting after every use, so the internal spring could rest. Leave it cranked up on the shelf the way a careless borrower would, and the spring took a set and lost its accuracy over time. A father returned his to zero every single time, like clockwork, and he was not about to trust that discipline to anyone else. He would torque your head bolts himself in the right sequence and hand you back your keys. It is still the one tool serious mechanics will not share. A borrowed torque wrench is a wrench you can no longer trust, and trust is the whole job. Number 2, the combination square. Almost at the top, and it is a small tool that does an enormous amount. The combination square was a precision ground steel rule with a sliding head that a machinist or a fine woodworker used to check a perfect 90, mark a 45, find the center of a shaft, or set the depth of a cut, all with a precision measured in thousandths. The finest were made by Starrett, a company founded back in 1880 that built its whole name on accuracy you could stake your work on, and a Starrett square could cost more than any other hand tool a man owned. He kept it wrapped in an oiled cloth, away from the sawdust and the grit, because a square this precise was a square this fragile. Drop it, and the ground surfaces that made it accurate were gone, and a square that was even slightly off true would betray every careful line a man struck with it. A father knew his square was dead on because it had never once hit the floor, never been left out in the damp to rust. never been handed to someone who would set it down on a running saw table. When the neighbor asked to borrow it, the father did not even finish hearing the sentence. He would come mark the line himself. Digital angle finders do the job now, but a Starrett square from 50 years ago, kept clean and true, is still accurate enough to shame them, and the men who own them treat them like the heirlooms they are. And finally, number 1, the Craftsman ratchet and socket set. There was never any real contest for the top spot. If there was one tool an American father would not lend to his own brother, it was his good socket set. Craftsman, the house brand Sears launched back in 1927, put professional grade tools in the hands of the working man, and the ratchet was the crown jewel, the fine-tooth click of it, as familiar in a garage as a heartbeat. It came in a steel case with every socket in its labeled slot, and a father could tell at a glance if even one was missing. He knew the feel of that ratchet in the dark, under a car, by touch alone, the exact spot the mechanism grabbed. And that is the whole reason it never left the garage. A socket set was the most borrowable tool in the world, and that made it the most dangerous to lend. Sockets walked off, one at a time, until the case had gaps like a missing tooth, and the 10mm, always the 10mm, was gone forever. The ratchet itself got overcranked with a cheater bar until the fine gears inside stripped and it slipped under load. And a socket set with holes in it and a slipping ratchet was a set a man could no longer rely on when he was flat on his back in the cold with a stuck bolt over his face. Craftsmen famously replaced any tool that broke, no questions asked, but they could not replace the ones a borrower simply never brought back. So the father drew his line right there. You could borrow his ladder, his lawnmower, even his truck. But the socket set stayed home, and every man in the neighborhood understood exactly why. Because in the end, these 15 tools were never really about the metal and the wood. They were about a kind of care that is nearly gone now. The years a man spent tuning an edge to his own hand, the pride in a tool that worked because he had never let it be abused. When a father refused to lend his good square or his ratchet, he was not being selfish. He was protecting something he had built. Which one did your father guard the closest? Drop it in the comments. And if you still have one of these in a drawer somewhere, go pick it up. It remembers his hands.